Again, it's one of the most astounding things to us is that half of the burials are children, which tells us that the infant mortality rate or the child mortality rate among African New Yorkers, especially as they apply to children, was extremely high.
That gets us into the dissemination of this information. How is it done?
The Office of Public Education and Interpretation for the African Burial Ground Project began in May of 1993 when it seemed that there were so many requests from the public at large as well as the press as to, as a New York Times reporter said to me, how can it be that there's an African cemetery in the middle of a white neighborhood in Manhattan? Well, he was certainly erroneous in even asking that question, because in the 1700s or the 18th century, the cemetery itself was, to go back to this earlier map, the cemetery was in land that was considered to be outside of the city limits. There was a swampy pond here. This was known as the Palisades. Today, this is what we know as Chambers Street in Manhattan. This was an extremely rural area. The boundaries of New York City proper was Wall Street and Broadway, so that anything that was north of that in the 1700s was considered outside of the city limits. This information we believe to be very important to the public at large, certainly to African Americans in terms of looking at our own history in the city of New York, but to everyone else as well, because I certainly was told, as were a number of my colleagues, that there was no such thing, and we were told this by noted New York historians, as a significant African presence in early New York. We believe there to be more than 10,000 and quite possibly as many as 20,000 people buried in the African burial ground, although we only recovered 427. We know that on that same pavilion site that I indicated on the earlier map, is that at least 200 remain still underground on that site, on that national landmark site.
And these burial grounds, the African burial grounds, are being discovered, in quotes, throughout
the country, throughout certainly North America.
And New York State in particular.
Yes.
So, well, the reporter asked the right person, because I understand your dissertation was on the enslaved Africans of the North, or the history of New York.
Well, in particular, and a part of my dissertation was a social history of the African presence in New York, because contrary to what I was being told, the historical evidence says quite clearly that New York was a major slaveholding state, that in fact during the 18th century when the cemetery was in use, the only place in North America that had a larger enslaved African population than New York City was Charleston, South Carolina. So
that's incredible.
It is. When we're told
our history books are really...
when we're told that slavery, particularly slavery of Africans, was confined to the South. This is simply erroneous. In fact, every one of the 13 original colonies at some point early in their development held enslaved Africans.
And this is an economic thing rather than
oh, I suspect
political.
It's both economic as well as social. Certainly we know, quite often I've heard scholars of Irish history say, in fact, that the British had perfected the enslavement in the form of their treatment of the Irish in Ireland before it was transported to America to be sort of taken out on Africans.